We're going to talk about the healthy new normal, and so we're going to cover the pandemic, how we got into this situation, a little bit about the lockdowns and the closures and the restrictions, and then we're going to touch on the masks and the vaccine as well. But the main thing really is to talk about how to move toward health and wellness, how to get well and stay well by eating and moving and thinking in ways that sort of get us not only out of the pandemic, but reduces our risk of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and all the other things we worry about. So we're living in a climate now that's literally gripped by fear, and it's all based entirely on a faulty narrative, which is basically a fear-based narrative. And every single one of these points, from the top to the bottom, is essentially false. The first one is that we're dealing with a deadly, novel coronavirus that's sweeping the planet. The second one is that nobody is immune and there is no cure. Asymptomatic people are the main drivers of the disease. And so therefore we have to lock down, wear masks, stay in our homes until the vaccine shows up and we can all get vaccinated, and then we can get back to our lives. And anyone who challenges this narrative is not only a danger to society, but just a danger in general. So that is the false narrative. The way they were able to get us to do the lockdowns and the restrictions was based on the ability to keep the fear level at such a high pace. So the new normal, or the new abnormal, really, is that the PCR test does not diagnose infectiousness. And even the inventor of the PCR test, the Nobel Prize-winning inventor of this, said basically outright that it was never intended to diagnose the coronavirus. It was never never meant to be used the way it is. It creates a massive inflation in death numbers. The media essentially is propaganda with rampant misinformation. And we know this because the media's number one goal is to keep you consuming more and more media. And that's really it's not to keep us healthy or to keep us safe. The media's goal is to get us to consume more and more media. The vicious cycles of lockdowns, restrictions of movement and travel, these arbitrary rules like 6 feet of distancing and curfews and temperature checks, which we know are completely worthless. Vaccine certificates, so the vaccine passport's going to be rolled out. That's coming. Probably the scariest one of these revolves around that, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Loss of personal liberties, education, and our livelihoods. And it's fear, 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 fear. So fear of reinfection, fear of long-haul COVID, fear of resurgences and new variants and the unknown, uncertainty. We literally have been enslaved by fear. And when you look at the data, which we're going to show you, the fear is unjustified. In fact, in the face of the truth, all of this fear is completely unjustified. So here's the truth, here's the reality, and we're going to talk through these points later, but the overview is that we have a virus that presents a high risk to a few and a negligible risk to most. And it hits some regions, but not all. It's not global in the way that it's been sold to us. Areas like the continent of Africa have virtually no cases except for South Africa and a couple other outlying regions. So there are several available treatments, both natural and conventional or mainstream. The asymptomatic people, by the way, too, there's another name for asymptomatic people, and that's called healthy people. So we've renamed healthy people into asymptomatic carriers, but they're not the major drivers of disease. Lockdowns and mask mandates never have been recommended before, and they do not work. And they, in fact, cause lots of great harm. And then the vulnerable, the people we're supposed to be protecting, the elderly and the young, children and older people, are the ones that are actually hurt most by the efforts we're doing to prevent this. So where did this come from? So this whole fear narrative really started, this is from March 3rd. So this is Dr. Tedros. So say what you will about him. But he made 2 statements, 2 sentences, which in and of themselves are actually true. So he said on March 3rd that globally, what we knew at the time, that the case fatality rate of COVID was about 3.4%. And then he compared that to the infection fatality rate, which is 1% with the flu. So COVID, 3.4 case fatality, and then 1% if you're looking at the flu in terms of infection fatality rate. Now, those are 2 different figures and 2 different data analyses. Case fatality is based on cases that present for treatment, so the sick people that go to the hospital, versus infections, which is just people that had the virus. And when you look, so not only is it 4 days later, Dr. John Ioannidis from Stanford University, one of the most one of the most well-renowned infectious disease specialists came out with a report that said that the WHO's 3.4 rate not only caused horror, but is completely meaningless. And then he produced a paper which they finally had to put into print, where he said 61% of seroprevalence studies, he found the infection fatality rate across the entire population is only 0.23, which means that 99.77% of people that get the virus survive. And if you look at the younger people, people below the age of 70, their survival rate is 99.95%. And then that's the number I want you to keep in mind. So as we're talking about masks and vaccines and lockdowns and everything we've done in the last year, just remember that this has a 99.95% survival rate for people under the age of 70. So don't forget that number. Come on, guy. And when you look at the young compared to the old in terms of mortality and death, it's a 3 order of magnitude difference between the younger and the old people. So it's when they look at the deaths, they're not looking at the bigger picture. So everyone is susceptible. This is one of the main sort of the keystones for the fear mongering. Is they essentially announced, and this is Maria Van Kerkhove, found that everyone's susceptible. The entire globe is susceptible. Probably the biggest lie that we've been told so far right out of the gate. And it creates this sense of fear around human beings. Homo Sapienophobia, which everyone's a danger until proven healthy. So essentially, you're either at risk or you're a risk. You're one of those two categories. You're either at risk of getting it and dying or getting sick, or you're a risk of spreading it and giving it to someone else. And that simply is not true. The Diamond Princess cruise line, that was back in late January, so that really should have been a godsend, a perfect petri dish study where we could see people, thousands of people confined in one area with an infectious, deadly virus spreading through the cruise ship. Very little ability to quarantine, but what they actually found was of the thousands of people on board, a very small minority of those people got infected, a very small minority of those people actually got sick, and a small minority of those actually died. And it was about 12 people over the age of 65 out of thousands. But this sort of just fell by the wayside, and no one talked about it. The asymptomatic drive of disease essentially came from one lady in Germany, and they found that they labeled her as asymptomatic, and they found that she infected 16 other people based on her contacts for those few days. And if you do just a small amount of digging, you can find that she was actually being treated for flu-like symptoms. So she was not asymptomatic, but that's what launched this whole asymptomatic spread. Back in June of 2020, the WHO, Maria Van Kerkhove, came out and said asymptomatic spread of coronavirus is very rare. And then not 2 days later, she was forced to go back up on stage and announce that, well, we don't know in our models, we're not really sure, we don't have all the data. She was forced to flip-flop because that gave so much media attention. Even Dr. Fauci, Emperor Fauci said back in early or late January that asymptomatic transmission has never been a driver of outbreaks. In the history of every other respiratory virus and spread, it's never been spread by asymptomatic people. That's a novel concept. In JAMA, they found that the symptomatic spread within the household was roughly 18%, versus the asymptomatic spread within the household was only 0.7%, which is a very, very small fraction if you're looking at the data. And then lockdowns. Dr. Bruce Aylward probably needs to be convicted for crimes against humanity because he's the one that springboarded the entire need for lockdowns approach that we took in America. So he took a delegation of people over to China. He studied what they were doing in their community, and he found that, well, they're completely locking down their society, and there's not very many people dying, so that's what we need to do in the U.S. So that's what we use to adopt these restriction and draconian lockdown measures we've taken. So prior to COVID-19, this is essentially what we did. If you had a respiratory virus that was spreading, we would use essential effective measures which we know have worked and stood the test of time. So isolation of the sick and hand washing. Now we're going to talk about a few other measures nutritionally and with lifestyle, but it's essentially isolating the sick and washing our hands versus, and we knew this all along, the things that are completely ineffective, large-scale quarantines, which when you quarantine healthy people, that's called slavery. That's not quarantine, and we've never done that at any point in history because we know that it doesn't work. Border closures, school closures, social distancing, and masks, all brand new novel concepts used to stop a respiratory virus. And again, Dr. John Ioannidis, most of the estimates of how we handled the lockdowns increased the problem and were actually pro-contagion, so made the problem worse. So when you look at lockdowns, you look at the lockdown, and state-by-state comparisons are really not the best science, but it's certainly worth noting. North Dakota versus South Dakota. In North Dakota, you had masks and severe lockdowns and school closures and restrictions, where in South Dakota, there was no mask mandate, no business restrictions. And you look at the trend, and it's essentially the same. If anything, the only thing you can really firmly conclude from this is that the South Dakota with less lockdowns and restrictions actually had a little bit flatter curve. And then when you look at Sweden, everybody said early on, I remember this time last year, I made a video about Sweden and we ought to adopt their approach of herd immunity. And everyone said that was going to be slaughter. That they estimated 100,000 extra people would die in Sweden before the month of May was over. And they actually found when you compare Sweden to the UK, where UK had the lockdowns and the restrictions, where Sweden had no lockdowns, they were wide open, the masks were optional, the curve is almost completely identical. And the death rate per capita, 0.06, same thing in Sweden is 0.06. Sweden had essentially the same number of deaths this year as they've had every year for the last 10 years. The same 10-year average applied to last year just as well. So we know that they don't make a difference. Men think in herds, they go mad in herds, and they only recover slowly and one at a time. So it just takes an individual awakening and then at some point kind of standing for what's right and doing what we know is true in our heart. So the lockdowns have caused multiple other effects. We call these side effects because we don't like them, but this is just what lockdowns and restrictions do. 1.2 million more child deaths than in previous years, 150 million more people pushed into extreme poverty, 130 million people threatened with starvation, 40 million new jobless claims, delays in diagnosis and treatment of cancer and other chronic diseases, and then the diseases of despair. And this, sadly, has affected our young people far more than it has the older, but the suicides. We know that suicide is up almost 16-fold. So there's a 1,600% increase in suicides this year based on what we've done to our economy and to our communities. The drug and alcohol abuse is skyrocketing, spousal abuse, domestic abuse, just anxiety, depression, all those things have increased based on what we've tried to do to stop the virus. 1.6 billion people and children are out of school, and we know that online learning is a complete catastrophe. My daughter did online learning. Luckily, she's at a school now with an amazing headmaster who's sort of plowed through and kept the schools open, but everyone closed at the last end of the last semester last year. And within those 3 months, her mood changed, her grades were suffering. She was essentially declining as a human being because we were forcing her to stay home and stay on a computer for 7 hours a day. For a population who's not even at risk of getting the virus, it's a negligible risk for children, and they're not at risk for giving it to other people. And there's no data that supports what we've done. So where did the mask, if you think that the lockdowns are insane, the masks are no different. So the mask mandate came, or the reason we propagated this idea really came from a study where they took 2 hairdressers and they found that because they were positive, they tested positive on the faulty PCR test, and they worked on several clients, most of whom were probably young and healthy anyway. None of them got sick. So masks must work, right? If you look a little bit deeper, this is Dr. Fauci back in February.
People should not be walking around with masks. You're sure? Because people are listening really closely to this. Right now, there's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing perfect protection that people think that it is. And often there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask and they keep touching their face.
And can you get some schmutz sort of staying inside there?
Of course. But when you think masks, being them and people who are ill.
You missed that part, but he said mainly for healthcare workers and for people that are ill. So they've come back on that statement because that got a lot of press, and they said, well, he was telling us that because he didn't want us to use up all the PPP, or the protective equipment. We want to make sure we keep that for the healthcare workers. So either he was lying about the fact that it really doesn't do any good, or he was lying to us to keep us from buying. Either way, we were being lied to when it comes to that fact. This is a policy review, and they found no evidence that surgical masks are effective, and when they're worn by infected persons, they do nothing to reduce their susceptibility. So it doesn't work for the person wearing it, doesn't work for the person that's around the person wearing it. And then if you're comparing the mask states to the non-mask states, again, not the best scientific comparison, but it bears looking at. There's virtually no difference in the spread of the virus. It continues. Viruses do what viruses do, and that's just a reality that we're just going to have to learn to live with, sadly. And forget about the science, here's a little common sense.
Hey guys, does double masking work against coronavirus's transport? Find out. First we're going to do the hospital masks, 3-ply. Here's one. Here's two. Next we're going to try a cloth mask. Remember, we want to stop this moisture that's coming out of our mouth because that's what COVID rides on. Here's one. Here's two. Next we're going to try an N95 with a cloth mask. There's one.
See, even the N95 doesn't.
Here's a cloth mask on the N95. There's one. Here's a cloth mask on the N95. Now we're going to try two N95s. So we can see that double masking does work, lock down the moisture. Some double mask more than others. So use this information as your shield, as it were, against this invisible enemy, coronavirus's transport. Don't get vaporized.
You know, and is that a double-blind scientific study? No, but it bears to note that these do not work remotely the way that we're being taught. If anything, it just disperses it in different directions. And then we've gone to this measure where we've got kids that are literally living around plexiglass, scared to touch objects or touch other people or be around and hug and embrace other people. It's what we're doing to the children is really the most sinful part of this whole phenomenon. And then a bit about the vaccines. And remember, when we're talking about the vaccine, we're talking about a virus with a 99.95% survival rate in people under the age of 70. So we must get 7.8 billion people vaccinated in order to keep us all healthy. And no one is safe unless everyone is safe. And that comes from Gavi, which is the conflict of interest Bill Gates funded, and you could say what you want about that. But they're saying no one is safe until everyone is safe. When has that ever been a policy? Like, why do we drive automobiles? If everyone has to stay safe and we're not tolerant of any risk, then why do we drive automobiles? Why do we sell alcohol? Why do we allow people to own guns? We give teenagers, 16-year-old kids, a cell phone and let them drive on the interstate. So this whole notion that we can't allow we have to save all lives at all costs is just nonsense. It's not what we do in our daily lives. And this is from VAERS. So VAERS is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. So it's a government-funded system where you can go in and you can make claims, or you can report deaths, hospitalizations, urgent care, asphyxiation. So this is through April the 9th. So roughly 3 months into the vaccine program, we see 2,600 deaths, or 2,602 deaths, which essentially accounts for 24% of all the deaths ever recorded from VAERS. From all the vaccines over 31 years, there's been 2,600 deaths just from COVID alone in 3 months. So in 31 years, they literally have had 75% of those deaths have been non-COVID related. And it's estimated, too, that the reporting to VAERS is about 10% of what actually occurs. So that number could be tenfold that if you look at the data. 5,000 hospitalizations, 10,000 urgent care, 10,000 office visits, asphyxiation or anaphylaxis, Bell's palsy, heart attacks, miscarriages, severe allergic reactions, and thrombocytopenia. That's the condition for which the AstraZeneca vaccine was removed and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was removed, was because it was found to cause thrombocytopenia, which is a common blood disease. And this is the woke pope. So this is a fake meme. But it's going to be your ticket to heaven. And obviously that's not real, but it does indicate sort of where we're headed, that you have to have a vaccine passport to travel, to get on a cruise ship, to go to a sporting event, if you want to renew your license or get a driver's license, or a license to work. That sounds insane, that we would make people carry around or have some sort of passport to show that they've been vaccinated for a virus that's so deadly that 99.95% of people fully recover. And if we think that that can't happen, look at what's happened in the last 12 months. I mean, nothing is out of the question at this point. And by the way, too, with the vaccine, it's not a vaccine. It's a experimental biologic gene therapy drug. So it's an experimental biologic gene therapy drug, which no other vaccine has ever been produced this way. There's absolutely zero long-term safety studies. We have no idea what it does to fertility, to pregnancy, to the risk of autoimmune diseases and cancer and diabetes. There's just absolutely zero long-term safety studies. And they say they haven't done any experiments, which is not really true because they're doing a current experiment as we speak. Millions and millions of people. And may it show some promise in reducing severity of symptoms? That seems to be the case. But we know that it doesn't prevent transmission or infection, which means essentially the data is pretty in the air that can you still get it? I'm not sure. And can you transmit it? That's still questionable. And it's funny how we were raised not to be peer pressured into taking experimental drugs, and now we're being peer pressured into taking experimental drugs. It's funny how I always learned that in high school, that you don't ever get pressured into taking drugs. This is from Martin Luther King. He said, "Our lives begin to end the day that we become silent about the things that really matter." And I think it's a point at which, prior to recently, I just kind of stayed in my own lane, stayed silent, but at some point we have to start speaking up because, I have children and my daughter's looking up to me. She wants to know how I'm handling this situation. So at some point, we have to start speaking up. All right, so the obesity rates in the U.S. have increased 152% since 1960. 70% of Americans are overweight or obese. 70% of Australians consider themselves sedentary. And 24% of Americans report no daily activity. And in Tennessee, I think that number is closer to 30% of zero physical activity ever. And then we look at the per capita drug use in the U.S. It's skyrocketed every year. It gets more and more. And we're now consuming roughly 25 million pills per hour. And the question would be, if that works and that's helping us, then we can continue that. But are we getting healthier or sicker as a country? And the numbers get worse even though we keep consuming more and more pills. U.S. medical spending, so heart disease is $501 million, cancer is $430 million, digestive orders $337 million, obesity $320, diabetes $273 million, arthritis $118, and osteoporosis, just the fractures alone, is $38 million per day. That's per day in America. We spend that amount of money per day for those conditions, which are virtually all preventable. And this is from 2020. Those are old statistics. So what do you think has happened in the last 20 years? Do you think those numbers have stayed flat or gotten worse? Absolutely gotten worse. So are we sick because of bad choices? Or are we sick because of bad luck, bad germs, or bad genes? The reason the U.S. has been hit so hard is because of the condition of the health of our population. I remember the vice presidential candidate debate. The moderator asked a brilliant question. She said, well, why is the U.S. being hit so much harder than a lot of other industrialized nations? And of course, none of the candidates answered that question because they don't. But the answer is pretty clear. It's because we're sicker. So the sicker the population, the worse you're going to be affected by coronavirus or the flu or pneumonia or any other infectious agents that challenges the immune system. So we can adopt this same surgery, drugs and surgery to treat disease approach, or the wellness, lifestyle, and prevention to promote health and prevent illness. And again, I'm not against drugs and surgery. If you have a severed artery, or you have an emergency or a crisis trauma situation, thank God that we have that system, but the reality is that's not what gets us into most chronic diseases. In fact, it gets us into none of those chronic diseases. So the fire department. Our current healthcare system operates very similar to the fire department. So fire departments essentially use two main tools. They use axes and fire hoses. So if you have a fire in your house, who do you call? The fire department, right? And if you call them and you call them early enough and they get there on time and they do a good job, they'll kick down your front door and bash out your windows and spray down your furniture and belongings. And if they do a good job and you called them early enough, can they save the life of your house? Absolutely, right? And should you be grateful for that? Of course, eternally. But the question is, what's left when they're gone? It's a mess, right? And how much sense would it make logically to call the same fire department back the next day to restore the health of your house, to rebuild your house and get it stronger and healthier? Or do you need a different contractor and a different specialist with a different set of skills in order to perform that job? So that's the problem, is we have the fire department that not only puts out emergencies, that helps us when we're injured or we have crisis or we need help with trauma, but we also rely on that same system to build our health and keep us healthy, and it was never designed to do that. Let's talk a bit about vitamin D. One of the main things we can do in terms of preventing COVID or reducing the severity of COVID if we get it, and then also in terms of allergies and arthritis and cancer and autoimmune disorders. Vitamin D is not a vitamin. It's actually a hormone. It's a prohormone, and it's the substrate of all of your sex hormones. So testosterone and estrogen and thyroid stimulating hormone. All of our hormones require adequate amounts of vitamin D in order to happen. So the myth is that the sun causes skin cancer. Now, the sun can be an irritant of the skin, but in and of itself, that does not cause skin cancer. Otherwise, all skin cancer would happen on the tip of your nose and on your face, which is where we typically get the most sun. I have a patient that had skin cancer on the back of his knee. There's anal melanoma. So there's a lot of ways to get cancer that have nothing to do with the sun. Cultures that get the most sun actually have the least amount of skin cancer. And here's the big deal. When you go to get your blood test, you want to make sure that your levels are between 60 and 90. Now, the traditional vitamin D blood test says as long as you're above 30 and you're not too high above 100, then you're fine. Well, 30 is the cutoff for rickets. And you guys know rickets is a bone softening disease because of chronically low vitamin D. So when you get your skin test or your blood test, you want to make sure it's between 60 and 90, ideally. This is the research with vitamin D and COVID. So you took vitamin D levels that are less than 20, vitamin D levels that are between 21 and 29, and vitamin Ds in green that are above 30. In the critical cases, those that died or ended up on respirators, the vast majority of them were between that 29 and less value. And you get to severe COVID disease, it's essentially the same. And then when you get to ordinary COVID, like the way most people respond, it gets a little bit better, but until you get your vitamin D levels above 30, do we see a milder presentation of COVID disease? And the reason is because it helps to offset the cytokine storm. That's what kills people when they get COVID. It's not the virus that does it, it's the immune system's overreaction to it is what causes so much damage. So it's all about the reaction. Vitamin D helps to modulate that cytokine storm. Why have we not been talking about this for the last 12 or 13 months? It's the simplest thing on the planet. You could get all 7.8 billion people, you could give them $50 worth of vitamin D, and they could all get their vitamin D levels up to a normal range. But that's not the narrative, because you can't sell, you can't patent, you can't own the market on vitamin D because it's a naturally occurring substance. So instead, we looked for drug-based synthetic alternatives to treat the disease, not prevent it in the first place. So into nutrition, we got to go through a few myths, because there's a lot of things that we know and we think we know about nutrition that we think that we've known for years that are really, well, I call them myths, but they're really outright lies. That fat makes you fat, that it clogs your arteries, that builds up plaque in the system, and that low fat is actually better. Well, we've seen 4 decades now of low-fat everything you can imagine. You have low-fat cookies and low-fat donuts, low-fat yogurt and ice cream, low-fat milk, but then we have more high-fat people than we've ever had in our lives or in history. So the reality is it's not the fat that makes us fat, it's our body's inability to burn it and metabolize it. So we actually have to have fats. Like there's different types. There's healthy fats, fats that make you fat, and there's fats that help make you skinny. There's fats that will kill and fats that heal, and there's fats that drive up inflammation, and there's fats that actually reduce and calm down inflammation. So what's an example of a bad fat? Give me a bad fat. Donut. Donut is a little WMD. It's a little weapon of mass destruction. It's got bad fats, it's got flour, it's got sugar. It's sort of a beautiful combination that we all love of every type of bad thing that we could almost imagine. But vegetable oils, one of the biggies, the main source of bad fats for most people are vegetable oils. Has everyone ever heard of canola oil? So do you know where canola oil comes from? Because there's no such thing as a canola plant. It doesn't exist. Even though sometimes they'll put a little ear of corn looking thing on the bottle, canola stands for Canadian Oil Low Acid. So it's an acronym for genetically modified rapeseed oil, highly omega-6, it's highly inflammatory, and it's rancid by the time it reaches the grocery shelf. So canola oil is a big no-no. But if you look at the little label of approval on the canola oil, you'll see the American Heart Association recommends canola oil, and sometimes the American Diabetic Association. So they're endorsed by these companies because of all the conflicts of interest. It's all about the money. And what's the best way? Well, let's talk about this first. Here's some of your healthy fats. I should have made you name these first, because most people, when I say name a healthy fat, they say avocados and olive oil. And that's about where everybody stops. But there's a lot more. So grass-fed meats, so meats that come from healthy animals, because we'll talk about in a second, the health of the animal makes all the difference. You have grass-fed butter or ghee, avocados and avocado oil, tree nuts like almonds, macadamia nuts, pecans, walnuts, no peanuts. So peanuts are actually a legume. It's not a nut, it's a legume. It grows on the ground, not up in a tree. So it's highly moldy, omega-6, and highly inflammatory. So avoid peanuts at all costs. It contains aflatoxin. Stay away from peanuts, although I love peanut butter. But then there's almond butter, right? Fatty fish, small, cold water fatty fish, ideally. The fish that I cannot stand to eat except for salmon, which is great, but like herring and sardines and mackerel and all those oily, small, fatty. Why smaller fish versus bigger fish? Because the bigger fish eat the smaller fish. So the bigger the animal, the more it bioaccumulates the toxins that were in that animal. Does that make sense? So the smaller fish are better because they're eating plankton and little bitty tiny things, where tuna are eating lots and lots of smaller and smaller fish. What about crab and lobster? That's what I always, well, what about crab and lobster? Because I love some crab legs and I love some lobster with drawn butter. The reality is those are not fish because they don't have gills and they don't swim. They are bottom feeders that eat the poop of the other fish that swim above them. So they're highly toxic, heavy metals, mercury, arsenic. I mean, now, do I still eat, peel and eat shrimp occasionally? Of course. And with a lot of these, with nutrition, it's the 80-20 rule. So you want to be 80% healthy and then you 20% American. So it's 80-20, right? That was a joke. I've been told so many times how unfunny I am. But I can't stop. Cooking oils, extra virgin olive oil, flaxseed, and sesame seed oil. So at low temperatures, ideally, this is a general rule, so low temperatures, you want olive oil and butter. Those are your better lower temperature oils, because if you heat up a good fat, what does it turn it into? It turns it into a bad fat. So you never want to turn a good fat into a bad fat, and the best way to do that is by heating it up too much. It turns rancid. And then at your higher temperatures, you have like grapeseed oil, coconut oil, and avocado oil. Those are your higher flash point, more stable, high temperature oils. And then again, palm kernel, red, those are all the goods. So the key is to add the healthy fats as we're taking out the bad ones. What about grains? Grains are healthy, right? You got to have 11 servings according to the pyramid or the plate or the whatever the ridiculous thing they're using now with the FDA. But 11 servings a day, because you got to get your B vitamins, you got to have fiber. Like, how did we ever go to the bathroom before we had processed bread at our disposal, right? The truth is grains turn to sugar. So if we eat grains, and I'm not talking about buckwheat and amaranth and quinoa and couscous. Like, I'm not talking about those grains. We're talking about bread, pasta, cereal, crackers, chips, pretzels, cookies, bagels, muffins, pastries, oatmeal. Yes, oatmeal. Those are the grains that we're talking about. So they turn to sugar virtually immediately. So when you eat a piece of bread, how quick does it turn to mush? Like before it gets to the back of your throat, right? And though that mush is essentially sugar. So the amylase in our saliva converts that grain into a simple, not even a simple carbohydrate. So the grains increase inflammation, and what diseases we'll talk about are linked to inflammation, and they contain two sticky proteins that are called gluten and gliadin. So we've come up with this mnemonic, and it's turn off your G, P, and S. So it simplifies the foods that, in general, we like to try to avoid. G, P, and S. So if you eat these three foods, your GPS is set toward diabetes and cancer and cardiovascular disease and arthritis and autoimmune. So you want to turn off your GPS. Grains, like we talked about, bread, pasta, cereal, crackers, chips, pretzels, cookies, bagels, muffins, pastries, and oatmeal. Processed food and processed dairy, primarily processed dairy. Processed yogurt, processed milk, processed ice cream. Those are the biggies, and then sugar. Again, 80-20. 80% healthy, 20% American. So there's still a little leeway. If you're healthy and you're happy, you don't have any of these diseases, and you like your weight and how you feel, sleep good, energy's good, then, add a little, slate in a little 20% for those things. But if you're not at your goals, you're not where you want to be, then you need to look to avoid those as much as we can. Because it's the underlying driver of all the diseases that we really worry about. The biggest cost, the healthcare, the financial cost to our healthcare system, the physical cost to our families involves all of those diseases. And we all have family members that have neurological disease. Oh, by the way, COVID is a pulmonary disease. Part of the cytokine storm is related to inflammation. So if you just want to do it for COVID, then reduce the inflammation for that very reason only. And here's the myth with protein. So we need more of it. You got to eat more protein. We need more protein. I hear that all the time. The key is that we don't need more. We just need enough. You need the right amount of protein, enough to get your body through the day. The more you work out and exercise, the more protein you probably need, because excess protein converts to sugar. So if you eat more protein than your body can process or deal with at a sitting, then the excess of that protein is converted to sugar. And then sugar is metabolized to stored fat. For most women, it's about 15-ish grams per meal, probably more like 10 to 15 grams of protein per meal. And for most men, it's 20, maybe 25 grams per meal. If you look at a big piece of chicken breast, that's anywhere north of 40 grams of protein, sometimes 50, depending on the size. So we're eating 2 or 3 times the amount we need just in one serving of protein, and it all goes to sugar. So the health of the animal is what makes the difference. So when you're talking about chickens or fish or beef, if it's a healthy animal, it's a healthy animal product. So these are the healthy, happy cows, the ones that graze and get like sunshine and hang out with each other and are not pumped full of hormones and vaccines and chemicals and fed antibiotics. They eat grass instead of grain. What happens to an animal when it eats grain all day? It gets fat and sick, right? So then they force them, because they keep them in these little pens or cages essentially, which is completely inhumane, but they have to give them antibiotics and all these vaccines in order to keep them alive. And for a cow to make it to slaughter, it only has to be standing upright. It doesn't have to be able to walk or moo or move. All it has to be able to do is stand on its own 2 feet. So a lot of times they'll prop these cows up on their feet with a forklift so they can get them to slaughter. It's just really inhumane. The problem is if you go to J. Alexander's or McDonald's, you're probably getting the same meat. So you kind of have to know the source, buy free range, organic. You do a cow share. There's different ways to do that. And these are the happy chickens that like to hang out with the happy cows. So they eat grub worms and vegetation versus, do you know what that pond is underneath? That's a chicken farm. Do you know what the pond is underneath? What's grown in the pond? That's your tilapia pond. So if you love tilapia, which is not even a real fish, it's like a frankenfish, they put the chicken coop over it so that they can feed. It's like a 2-for-1 deal. It's great. It's very smart economically. So you look at like farm raised versus wild caught. They have to give the farm raised stuff like this pink synthetic dye so that it sort of looks like real actual fish. So, and then PCBs and arsenic and phthalates, and there's all kinds of toxins. So ideally, wild caught, free range, organic, know the source if you can. That's sort of the name of the game with our meat products. And intermittent fasting, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through this. I encourage you to look it up. I do like a 16-8, so 16 hours off and 8 hours on window for intermittent fasting. Highly effective for repairing your mitochondria, reducing inflammation, balancing your blood sugar, increasing ketone production, reducing cell proliferation, which is actually another name for cancer, heart rate, blood pressure. It's almost too many benefits to name, but I highly recommend if you're over the age of 18 and you're under the age of 80, then generally you fit the mold for intermittent fasting. It's not recommended for children and for senior citizens, but every one of us, all the rest of us. So I haven't eaten since, 8 o'clock last night, and I'll probably eat my first meal. It's about noon, or it's about 11 right now. I'll probably eat about another hour and a half, because after 10 hours you start running on ketones, which are actually more efficient. Your brain prefers ketones over sugar, so it's actually a more efficient fuel source. And then the key is to be metabolically flexible, where you can use carbs when you have carbs or when you need them, and you can use fat when your body needs fat. It's the ability to switch back and forth between those two fuel sources. The problem is most Americans are pegged in the carb direction, which is why they get hungry every 3 hours, they get fatigued, they have a lot of sinus allergy, just irritable bowel, sleep issues. Those are typically your carb or sugar burners. So the trick with this is to get metabolically flexible. So here's we'll run through these real quick. So people who had fresh fruit or veggie every day had a 32% greater chance of fatal stroke. People who do not eat fresh fruit every day, 32% greater chance of fatal stroke and 24% greater chance of fatal heart attack. Researchers found that 60% less of kidney cancer in people that ate apples versus non. The animals that were fed cruciferous veggies had a 90% reduction in cancer rate after exposure to aflatoxin. That's the one that's found in peanuts. So nutrition really does matter. Men who ate fresh fruit every day had a 70% chance of dying from cancer of the digestive tract than those who ate almost no fruit. It's the apple a day. Here's some of the benefits of moving well. You can prevent, it's eat, move, and think. This is our moving portion of the eat, move, and think. Prevent 91% of cases of obesity and type 2 diabetes, which costs $519 million per day in the United States. Prevent 50% of all cases of heart disease, and reduce your risk of stroke by 25 to 30%. Prevent up to 50% of all stroke deaths. Reduce congestive heart disease by 63%. Hospital readmissions for heart failure by 71%, normalize blood pressure, reduce the risk of getting high blood pressure, restore and maintain heart and blood vessel health, maintain normal cholesterol and triglyceride levels. There's more. reduced risk of breast cancer by 60%, pancreatic cancer by 50%, lung cancer in smokers by 72%, melanoma by 72%, 50% of colon cancer, reduce the risk of rheumatoid and osteoarthritis, prevent osteoporosis, and reduce the $38 million a day we spend on it. Increase strength, flexibility, and balance, reduce gallbladder removal by 20%, reduce gallstone formation, improve digestion and bowel function elimination, increase immune function. There's more. Decrease all-cause mortality by 67% in the general population. Decrease all-cause mortality by 50% in the 61 to 81-year-olds. Prevent up to 47% of cognitive impairment, 62% of Alzheimer's, better physical function, decreased chance of ever being in a nursing home. And there's more. Decreased rate of aging, learning capacity, increased serotonin, decreased depression, decreased stress, increased growth hormone, and decreased risk of weight gain and obesity. From walking. All that just from walking. So they got all that data from taking test subjects and put them through 30 minutes of walking 5 days a week. Rigorous walking 5 days a week. That's it. There was no CrossFit. They didn't have to throw weights over their head. It was literally just from walking. So the biggest complaint I get all the time is I don't have time to exercise, or I don't have the equipment, or I don't have the money. So if you own a pair of tennis shoes and you have 30 minutes, then the homework is you have to go outside every day and you got to put your tennis shoes on. You don't have to walk. You just have to go outside and stand outside with your tennis shoes on. And then while you're outside, you have to do deep breathing for 30 minutes. That's it. You don't have to walk. You just got to put your tennis shoes on and go outside and just do deep breathing. And then, at some point you're going to check the mail. Eventually, you're going to get to where you walk for 30 minutes. It's really not all that hard. So it's just progressive, small changes over time. The nervous system, this is why I fell in love with chiropractic, because it's based on how God designed our bodies. We're designed with a nervous system, a brain, and a spinal cord, and the nerves that tell our body how to function. The way you heal and function is your brain sends messages down the spinal cord, out the nerves, into all the other organs, cells, and tissues. There's no health and healing without that system. If your brain, for every time your heart beats or you breathe air in your lungs, your brain is literally sending a message back and forth between those organs. If I was to cut the nerve to the organ would be dead. That would be a decrease in nerve supply, because you cannot survive without nerve supply. You can go a month with no food, you can go days without water, minutes without air, but you cannot go 1 second without nerve supply. And there's a way to know how important something is to your body. It's based on how long you can go without it. So air is actually more important to your body than water, and water is actually more important to your body than food at a critical level, and nerve supply is more important than all of those. So again, that's the way it's designed. The spine's job is to protect the nervous system. So you have a spine, and this one's colored, but it's the same essential thing. So your brain sits inside the skull, and it sends messages down into the spinal cord and out through the nerves to tell every organ, cell, and tissue how to function. The nerves in the top of the neck go to the eyes, ears, nose, and throat. The thyroid and the heart are more toward the lower part of the neck. You get into your upper back, you have the nerves that control the digestive system, and down lower we have the reproductive system, bowels, and you get the picture. So in order for the brain to talk to it, it has to send the message out through that little nerve, and if the spine moves out of its normal position from an injury or a car accident or slips and falls or trampolines or contact sports, car accidents, falling on the ice, if it moves the spine out of position with or without pain, it can compromise or put pressure on the nerve. And we know it only takes the weight of a dime on the nerve to cause about 60% loss of function. So you don't have to have a strangulated pinched nerve. It can almost be a light amount of abnormal pressure, and it affects whatever the nerve is talking to. So our job as a chiropractor and a specialist within chiropractic is to get the spine back into a normal functioning position to remove the pressure from the nerves. And we get tons of people that come in with different conditions. The most common that we see, obviously, which is the most culturally well known with chiropractic, is your sciatica and low back pain. And then neck pain and headaches, back pain, those are pretty common. But then the ones that are kind of more surprising with most folks is allergies, especially this time of year. Like, what would chiropractic have anything to do with allergies? But the nerves in the top of the neck are controlling the sinuses. So when you're exposed to pollen or to ragweed or to dust, your brain has to decide how it's going to react to the environment. And if those nerves don't work right, then the organs, the sinuses and the mucous membranes don't respond properly. There's another name for pollen and ragweed and dust and kitty cats, and that's called life. So the pollen is not the problem. It's the body's overreaction to the environment that's the problem. And that's all mitigated by the nervous system. The nerves that go to the head from the neck can control headaches, menstrual problems, high blood pressure. The nerves in the lower part of the neck actually control the heart, which is why the same nerve that runs down your arm is also controlling the heart. That's why when you have a heart attack, most people will kind of feel their arm as part of the symptomatology, but the same nerve controls both. Now, are there multiple causes for high blood pressure? Smoking, drinking, horrible diet, sedentary life? Of course. That's why we do all of this. We don't just do, just adjustments. We look at the whole picture. Depression, insomnia, again, carpal tunnel, dizziness, fatigue, acid reflux. And again, those are just warning signs. Those aren't really problems. It's just signs that your body is not functioning properly. So that's the focus. So the end of this is what do you stand for? And in relation to health, but also with what's going on in this crazy world that we're in. Just 2 days ago, my daughter came in. She's really upset. She came in a couple nights ago, and she said that there was some talk about coming over to our house to play, and that one of the kids said, I'm not allowed to go to your house because you guys don't respect COVID. That was the comment. Which, first, initially, I wanted to say, well, you're right, I don't. So congratulations. We're actually making it known that we don't respect COVID. But then, obviously it was sad because she was hurt by it. And I try to take that as one of those parenting moments where you kind of know that this is what you do next is she's going to remember for a while. So I took the time to kind of sit her down. I said, honey, first of all, this is not our home. Like this is not where we live. This is just our earthly temporary location. This is a flawed and broken world that's run by a lot of flawed and broken people. And if you're being who you are and you're being true to yourself and you're being honest and you're living who God made you to be, you're being who you are, and people reject you, then they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting themselves. They're self-rejecting because you frighten them. If you're being yourself and being honest and they don't like you or they don't want to be with you, then that's their stuff. That's not your stuff. And I told her to always stand up for what you believe in. We have some differing views of the mainstream when it comes to health and vaccines and things like that, because most of the mainstream is sick and it's if you do what everybody else does, you get what everybody else gets, right? So we teach her to stand up and pull for the underdog and do what's right. Just always at all costs do what's right. So my question to you would be is what do you stand for? Like what really matters to your heart? Because we're at a point in time where I don't think we can stay silent about it anymore with the whole vaccine passports and the craziness about where our society's headed. I think we have to stand up for what we believe in. So our children are watching. So thank you. Yeah, you're loud. You're loud. Like there's 17